I sent you to reap that for which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. I think if we could just take one thing away today, that would be it. In Utah, believers have entered into the existing labor of other believers. My name is Shafovaloff, and I'm a volunteer research associate with the Utah Christian Research Center, also Mormonism Research Ministry. And I'm an evangelist, and as I slowly mature as an evangelist, I'm trying to be more thoughtful about being aware of the different local churches, being mindful of local churches, thinking about them as I talk to unbelievers, inviting them to existing local churches. Well, as I've grown slowly as a believer, I've also taken more interest in the history of Christian, of historical theology in the church and the development of the kingdom of God. And I've taken more of an interest, all the more because the Bible says that the church is the pillar and buttress of truth. So for all of its faults, the Holy Spirit has been at work in the church for 2,000 years. There's continuity there. I like to think of the church as a treasure chest. And we have full authority to just plunder, to reap from the treasure chest of 2,000 years of work. And so it's just very humbling. I keep looking at the word Presbyterian. Did I spell it right? I did, okay. I'm like horrified, like over there. We're going to talk about 10 different people, 10 different events, and then you'll see 10 different reasons. I'll explain that relative to early Presbyterian missionary work in Utah. I don't feel like I'm doing this justice. I feel like I'm skipping a rock over a lake, but I'm confident that I'm giving you breadcrumbs and that there's believers here that are going to take those breadcrumbs and run with them and get something more meaty. I'll tell you how this started for me. I was reading a feminist dissertation on women in the 19th century in Utah. And I found a footnote about Presbyterian women. And this is a strange journey. I'm not a feminist. I'm reading this dissertation. I found it's Mormon-related stuff. And there was a footnote about Presbyterian missionary women. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I went down that rabbit hole, and here I am. And so I'm just going to give you all the breadcrumbs I can. First, I want to ask, for our sake, what is a Presbyterian? I'm a particular Baptist. There's Bible church movement. There's Assemblies of God. There's Calvary Chapel, and there's the I don't know what I am's, and there's just believers, Christians. We're believers when we're Christians more first, and then that's any denominational identity is a secondary issue. But let me ask you, what is a Presbyterian? Classically, what does that even mean? I'll help you out. In the Baptist tradition, there's more of a focus on the autonomy of the local church, where there's no external accountability systems that, I'll put it bluntly, there's nobody outside your church that could fire your pastor, right? That the local church is governing itself. It's self-governing, has autonomy. In Presbyterianism, and I'm giving full permission to my brother Jason Wallace in the back to interrupt at any moment. He actually picked the right heckler's chair today. But please correct me at any point. In Presbyterianism, there's what's called maybe an ascending court system. With presbyteries, you can appeal to someone outside of the church who can, and there could be intervention at a higher level. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, but not hierarchical. It's to the appeal is to the broader church rather than to bishops or archbishops and whatnot.
So not to be confused with an episcopacy. So there's different polity or church government models in the historic Christian church. Baptists focus on local church autonomy, congregationalism. A Bible church movement, there's still church autonomy, but maybe your church elders have more authority than they can do things that don't require congregational buy-in. In Presbyterianism, there's a session with elders, so there's some local church autonomy relatively, right? But there's a larger system. There's also a confessionalism. So there's connectional. There's a connectional aspect, and is that the right word, connectionalism? And then there's confessionalism. In Presbyterianism, there's what's called the Westminster Standards. Is that right? Is it the three forms of unity?
That's Dutch.
That's Dutch? Okay, I'm mixing things up already. But there's at least the Westminster Confession, which is a governing document. It's a subordinate authority summarizing what Presbyterians see the Bible to teach, either explicitly or by good necessary consequence. Please.
Here in Utah, people have heard people rag against God being without body parts or passions. That's from the West.
That's from the Westminster Confession. Presbyterians, from a Baptist point of view, if we had to kind of one-line it, we say, oh, they baptize babies. That's how we think of them. So I'm a particular Baptist, and I think of Presbyterians as my big brothers. So in my community, in the waters that I swim in, we are often reading Presbyterians. We love the Puritans. We love the Protestant reformers. So they're our big brothers, and we look up to them. Have you ever seen the Splinter meme with the old short Splinter and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle? Okay, this is for the young kids. Okay. It's a great quote here. We must have fences. These are denominational or church boundary fences, but let our fences be low, and may we shake hands often. This is kind of a weird thing for people outside of Christianity, but people in Christian denominations like each other often. There's a camaraderie, and there's really neat opportunities in Utah for cooperation at an evangelistic level. Ecumenism can get a bad rap, but done well, it's a sweet fellowship between believers of different denominations. I want to put some names on your mental map for you. We're going to go through these. And if nothing else, these are breadcrumbs for you to chase out more study. Henry Kendall, Sheldon Jackson. We'll go through each of these. I think it's Samuel Gillespie, Duncan McMillan, Josiah Welch, J.M. Coiner, Robert McNeese, Francis Burke, Ella McDonald, and Alice Palmer. Henry Kendall was the secretary of the Presbyterian Board of Home Missions, and he basically did a scouting trip out to Utah and wanted to kind of check out Salt Lake City with a view toward missions, right? So he's in Salt Lake City. Have you guys ever heard of, I know this is kind of a sad story, but do you remember when Ravi Zacharias came to the tabernacle? And it was a big deal because the only other person to preach in the tabernacle was D.L. Moody. And so I'm like, okay, that's cool. D.L. Moody. I would love to get like a sermon manuscript someday of what he taught. We might have notes from that, but I'm reading about this history, and actually the first guy to preach in the tabernacle from a Protestant perspective was Henry Kendall. He came to Salt Lake City, and he was invited to preach in the tabernacle on a Sunday. Pretty interesting. So he though is like kind of doing a scouting mission, and he's coming back and reporting about Salt Lake City. I found another footnote, and I could not find the source for this. And oh my goodness, I have it in here. Okay, here it is. I found it. It's out of order. We'll come back to it. We'll come back to it. The next person is Sheldon Jackson. He's sort of a larger-than-life guy. He's in charge of a massive amount of territory. I think someone said he traveled over 1 million miles. Like, wow, okay. And so he's establishing missions and church. He's a strategist. He's helping organize the first Presbyterian congregations in Utah. Next guy is Samuel Gillespie. Hardcore guy. You think about church planning, you want like military veterans. You're like, go, 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 alpha males, to start it out at least. Maybe they don't, but it's, he served as a pastor in Corinne. And Corinne, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. Corinne is up north, and because of the railroad connections, there was a hope and an expectation that this would be, a hopping city. Later on, the Brigham had a railroad constructed that essentially ended up diverting transportation around Corinne. So it just dropped from like 1,500 people to 300 people, and it became kind of a disappointment. he pastored for some time in Corinne, and he ended up in Brigham City, where he faced opposition. And one of the interesting things about reading these stories is you kind of have to be responsible when you're reading the accounts of the sensational opposition. You're like, is this kind of how they feel things are going? Or so I'm trying to be a responsible reader, but it does sound like when they're arriving in these towns, it's like 100% LDS people. There's no non-Mormons there, and when they show up, it's a big deal. But he was considered a very brave missionary pastor. Established a mission school in 1890. Duncan McMillan, he shows up in Mount Pleasant to, it sounds like there were some Scandinavian ex-Mormons in Mount Pleasant who had a bit of a rebel streak maybe, and they were kind of excited for these non-Mormons to come in and start some schools. So I think they built a meeting hall, and they were like, come on and preach and teach our kids. But when he showed up, there was a heavy opposition. But he ended up founding the Wasatch Academy, which I could be wrong, but it sounds kind of like it ends up being sort of a boarding school, high school type of school. And it still exists today. It's not Presbyterian school anymore, but the building's still there. There's still an educational institution. The artifact, if you will, is still there.
My sister went there.
Really?
Yeah, Mount Pleasant.
Wow. Small world.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like he was a strategist and he helped plan out the primary Presbyterian missionary strategy, which is essentially the school system that we'll talk about. Josiah Welch I think he was going to go to Montana, that's right, for a much more attractive assignment, having graduated seminary. I think he graduated seminary, but he was instead, yeah, of course, Presbyterians. You guys are all trained. They're a bunch of nerds. But he is persuaded instead to come to a much harder assignment. So he instead comes to Salt Lake City and organizes the first Presbyterian church in Salt Lake City. When the Presbyterians arrived, there was a little bit already here. There was the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians, and I think at the time, both the Episcopalians and the Congregationalists were faithful, evangelical, Bible-believing people. Those terms mean different things to us today. We'll talk about this, but when he starts the church in Salt Lake City, they had a really hard time finding a place to rent. And they attributed it to religious opposition. So they ended up starting the church in a hayloft. How do you say that word? Livery? And they ended up meeting also in a skating rink. I mean, so it was very humble circumstances. John Coiner starts a school in the basement, I think, of this Presbyterian church in Salt Lake City, and it grows really quick. And he pays for a lot of the expenses for the first 2 years, and then he appeals for support later. And one of the neat aspects of the story of Christians in Utah is much of what happened in Utah was owing to the collective effort of women out east, raising funds and sending teachers. So it's a really, really neat story. We'll talk about that. Robert McNeese pastored for 20 years at First Presbyterian Church. I think they got up to like 500 people. In Utah, in the late 1800s, the First Presbyterian Church in Salt Lake City, I think it was up to 500 people. It's known as a courageous pastor. Frances Burke, one of my favorite stories. I love her portrait there. She has this sort of "don't mess with me" determination, kind of a doggedness. And I love her story. We'll talk about this. She comes from Ohio as a missionary school teacher in Tokerville. The joke was not even the devil goes to Tokerville. It's just, out in the middle of nowhere, super rural. When she first shows up, she can't find a room to rent. And so she goes back down to St. George to regroup. And she gets a message from Nebuchadnezzar, a polygamist with 3 wives, and he's, hey, I got an extra room. And her mission president was like, time out, do not, don't do this. She ended up taking the room and finding another room shortly after, but she was just, I'm in it to win it. I'm going there to teach the children and teach the gospel. And she served over 40 years. We'll talk about her. One of my favorite stories about Francis. Okay, here it is. If you wanted to take a snapshot of that, go read it. It's on the online. It's a great article. How many missionary heroes do you know in Utah? We have, like in the larger missionary movement, we have missionary heroes, but Utah Christians are sort of like orphans. We've orphaned ourselves from our own history. So we don't know our own Christian history in Utah. Frances Burke is she's like a freebie here. Like, this is a great story of this dogged, determined, persevering lady who shows up to Tokerville. I saw that. There's the quote. Is this the place we are to live? Someone asks. And the answer was, well, surely neither God, men, or the devil will find us here in Tokerville. Let's see here. When the school was set up, I'll show you a picture in a second. I love this story. She summoned the children to school each day. I just brought this little bell from home just to give you a memory of this. Each day, she would start the day by ringing a large bronze bell that was held aloft by 2 pine poles. The bell was one of the unique features of her mission. A life of the missions, a friend of the missions in the East donated it to the school, and the bell bore the inscription, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land." So we have a picture of the schoolhouse. Isn't that neat? Wow. Look at that. I think that's essentially her parsonage, and then the schoolhouse, if I understand correctly. Maybe Allison knows better. She just visited that. Frances continued to ring her school bell. Well, I skipped something. There was at times conflict with LDS leadership. And at one point, the LDS leadership basically said, time out, stop sending your kids to the Presbyterian schools. Free day schools, there's no public school system. And I also think there was maybe some drama with Macmillan and Mount Pleasant. And that's kind of a sad story because it sounds like even Macmillan exaggerated for a time some of that conflict and some of the drama. But I mean, there was just a lot of drama going on, and the LDS leadership put a stop on, do not send your kids to the Presbyterian schools. So her school emptied out. It was heartbreaking. But she continued, let me have some fun here. She continued every morning to ring the school bell for months, until one by one her students returned. Frances also decided that if the people wouldn't come to her, she would go to them by nursing the sick, lending them good literature, teaching the people to can fruits and vegetables and to make pickles and sew. During the winter months, Frances began holding night school for young people whose education was neglected when they were children. She also broadened her influence in the community by becoming the postmistress of Tokerville on October 12, 1887, a position she held for more than 7 years. These acts of Christian service gave Frances the reputation of a woman who was always looking for ways to help others. Longtime residents of Tokerville remember her as a very talented woman, an organist, a pianist, teacher, a gifted singer. Frances continued to hold Sabbath school and other services every Sunday, beckoning worshipers to meetings with her school bell. When the pine poles that supported the bell eventually rotted and gave away, she placed it on the chapel porch, a mute symbol of her futile attempt to convert the Mormons. You can tell I'm reading something here by a non-Mormon who's not as sympathetic to the Christian aspect of her mission. Sometimes people will kind of pat the Christian missionaries on the head and say, but thank you for giving us, social benefits. Thank you for being a good neighbor. I appreciate that, but she wasn't there just to be a good neighbor. She was there to be a Christian witness. But this is a neat story. Continuing the article. On Armistice Day, does anybody know what Armistice Day is? Please.
End of World War I.
World War I ends, so there's a big celebration. A group of Tocqueville citizens came to Frances' door and asked if they could borrow her bell to herald the end of the war. She was startled and somewhat gratified when several in the party addressed her as sister instead of Miss Burke. After she gave her consent, the bell was hoisted onto the back of a Ford truck that was driven by the local Mormon bishop, Walter H. Slack. Bishop Slack insisted that Frances ride next to him on the front seat of the truck. They were followed by a high-spirited procession that paraded up and down the streets of Tocqueville, and they went to neighboring towns proclaiming peace and goodwill. What I love about the Frances Burke story, tired, so you can cry easier when you're tired, is the Presbyterians got totally punched in the gut when, in 1890, Utah got what? Public schools. And so it just gutted the Presbyterian school system. And that was their primary missionary strategy. And you have to understand, just a little later, Utah got statehood. And that year they said, we promise we'll give up, we'll suspend polygamy, and they had to promise that a few times more. But the exotic nature, the foreign sense of Utah, the strange foreign polygamous territory stopped being so strange, and it started becoming politically integrated. And so all the Christians in Utah were saying, hey, don't forget about us. But the money dried up, the fascination dried up, and some people had to just pack up and go back home. But what did Frances do? She stayed, and she dug in, and she kept teaching Sunday school, and she kept reaching the kids. And she had that bell on her front porch, and she was a fixture in the community. Wow. What a hero to teach our young ladies. What a 1 Corinthians 7 single-minded devotion hero of the Christian faith in Utah. What a name to teach our own people in Utah. What a name to traffic in our minds. We should know these names. Allison in the back was able to go visit her grave just this past week or two.
Don't you make me cry, Aaron. That's a lot.
Her house is for sale, by the way. Remember that? That's Zillow. It's beautiful in the back. Oh, look at that. Okay, next story. Ella McDonald. She began Presbyterian missionary work in Kaysville, Utah in 1882. She secured 1.5 acres ground with a small adobe cottage. She converted one room for her residence and the other for her schoolroom. That kind of sounds like something in parallel to what Burke did. And she taught faithfully for 5 years. Now, as far as I know, she didn't stay where she was at for decades like the others. But I still want to tell her story. This is Wishart. Samuel Wishart wrote a book in 1904. He's a Presbyterian who was telling the story of what had just happened in the past 50 years. And his book was distributed amongst other Presbyterians, and it has a really poor title. The title is called The Mormons, but it was really like a marketing thing. It was trying to pull you in, the Mormons. The book was about the Presbyterians in Utah, reaching the LDS people. So it's poorly titled, and it's really hard to find. So we have it now on mrm.org, and what I'm hoping to do in the next couple days is publish an audiobook of the book. And it's a really good listen, and most of us now are listening to books, right? Except my wife, she's got the kin. She listens to audiobooks too now. But I would love for us to read that book together and get to know our Presbyterian brothers more. It's not that long. It's a great story. But anyway, I'm going to read some of Wishart. Kaysville is the halfway station between Salt Lake City and Ogden. No permanent educational work was undertaken at this place until January 1882. Miss Ella McDonald came in September but was unable to find a location to begin her work until January. An acre and a half of ground was then secured with a small adobe cottage. The teacher fitted up one room for herself and the other for a school room. On the 16th of January, the mission school was fairly opened, and for 5 years, this faithful teacher, I love the way he's honoring her, toiled and wrought her life into the life of the pupils. The Sabbath school was opened with the day school. On the retirement of the first teacher, others followed. Now, one reason I love this story is it reminds me of how these women out east, their hearts were melted for the LDS women out west and for their children. And so they raised funds for these missionary schools. And then these young women at peak season where, courtship, find a husband, start a family, fertility, they are like, nope, I'm gonna take a big chunk of my life and I'm gonna go to Utah and I'm gonna be lonely for 5 years. Where I don't have quick access to a railroad, maybe. Where I don't have my friends, my Thursday night Target group, my Chili's, and I'm just being silly here. I don't have my mom in Florida, right? I don't have my high school friends. I give up all of that to go serve children in a rural town in Utah. And some people come to Utah today and they're like, I'm in it to win it. I'm going to be here till I die. You know what? You don't know that. And God honors those seasons of work. That just the 5 years. Okay, 5 years. I was thinking about Hebrews 6:10. For God is not unjust. He will not forget your work. 5 years of this lady toiling for these young children. And the love that you have demonstrated for his name by serving the saints, by continuing to serve them. Thank you, Lord, for seasonal laborers in Utah. Thank you, Lord, for sending seasonal labor. It's a picture of the church that she served at. Then there's Anna Bailey Palmer. I'm doing some guesswork here. The story is told of Alice Palmer, and I'm presuming here that Alice was her nickname, and I'll tell you why. She was a Presbyterian missionary who served in Monroe, but she died of pneumonia in 1891. So I think, how many years is that? 4 years? So she served as a mission teacher from 1887 to 1991. She died of pneumonia, and as she was dying, she asked to be buried with her people where she served. Now, as I look more at the story, it got even better. Quoting Wishart, churches and mission schools had been organized in Mount Pleasant, Ephraim, and Manti as far back as November 1877. Dr. McMillan preached at Monroe in Sevier Valley, Utah. He purchased a small frame building for church and school purposes. Miss Wheeler, single ladies, all these single ladies coming to Utah to be missionaries, entered upon her educational duties, opening a mission school. Remember that, Miss Wheeler. The work had been followed up by able and successful teachers. After some years, a fine stone chapel was erected. Now, as you read these stories, they got really excited about stone buildings, like shack stone. It was like a big upgrade. Furnishing 2 schoolrooms that can be thrown together by folding doors. For many years, 2 teachers carried on the mission, exerting a most salutary influence. 2 of the young ladies educated in the school came out of Mormonism, became Christians, entered Park College, and were graduated. They have both served for a time as mission school teachers. Did you hear what just happened? And are now making homes that give hostages to the state, in quotes. One of the judges now is on the Supreme Bench of the state, who is a loyal American, came from a Mormon family. He had his first educational awakening in the mission school at Monroe. As a judge, he has fearlessly executed the law against polygamists and polygamous cohabitation. Under the direction of the present synodical missionary, a very convenient home has been erected for the teachers. The teachers who have toiled at Monroe have borne a noble part in giving the truth to the people. Miss Alice Palmer gave herself devotedly to the families represented in her school, and after years of service was attacked with pneumonia, which terminated her life. She asked to be buried among those whom she loved, and to those whose spiritual welfare she had consecrated her life. And her plain monument today is a silent witness to her devotion to her master and to the people for whom she had toiled. She being dead yet speaketh, in quotes. The influence of her teaching and life. Think the influence of her teaching and life can never be lost. The mission is still carried forward. Now I'm looking at that story and I'm like, I gotta find this gravestone. This is pretty cool. So I find this and it's like Anna Bailey Palmer. And I'm like, yeah, but this is Alice Palmer, right? This can't be the same person. But then I look closer and it's like, family history says she graduated from Park College in Parkville, Platte County, Missouri. Elsewhere I read, for decades, the school, Park College, was affiliated with the Presbyterian Church. And then I go back to Wishart and I read, 2 of the young ladies educated in the school came out of Mormonism, became Christians, entered Park College, and were graduated. So I connected the dots and I was like, she got saved in the school, and then she left Utah, got a college education, and she came straight back to where she grew up. And she devoted, 4 years of her life? And then she died of pneumonia. God is not so unjust as to overlook your work and your love for the saints. Wow. Wow. What a legacy. What a legacy we have as believers in Utah. Pretty neat. I can't devote as much time to this section of the talk, in part because I didn't prepare adequately for it. But if you could just map out in your mind 10 different significant events in this story. First, Henry Kendall visits Salt Lake City. It's kind of a scouting mission. He's asked to preach at the tabernacle, but he reports back to the presbytery, and there is an effort on the part of Presbyterians to send out missionaries out west. In 1869, there's the first Presbyterian services in what city? Corinne. Corinne got the first Presbyterian church. Now, I did learn that at it was Camp Douglas, later Fort Douglas, there was a Presbyterian chaplain who did the first service. So he gets the first Utah Presbyterian service. But in Corinne, we have the first services, and then a year later, we have the Corinne First Church. A year later, we have First Presbyterian Church of Salt Lake City organized. The Presbytery is formed 4 years later. In 1875, we have the educational strategy. This is how we're going to reach Utah, right? And then they're like, well, we need more women and we need more funding. And so in 1887, they got the thumbs up. I won't go into the details, but basically a bunch of women, single women, were commissioned to come out to Utah as teachers. And in 1884, you have, we'll look at it in a second. I think it was like 37 schools. Think about that. In 1887, I'll confirm this in a second. There were almost, 40 Presbyterian day schools for children in Utah. That's incredible. 1884. Okay, I mixed up my dates there. Apologies. In 1890, the public school system began in Utah, which was devastating to the Presbyterian missions. In 1902, I think it was initially called the Salt Lake Collegiate Institute, and they renamed it to the Sheldon Jackson College, and then it became the Westminster College. Just a little bit of a note here. I learned about Henry Kendall preaching at the tabernacle, and I was like, we've got to chase out this footnote and figure out more details. And so I found the document for it, but it was at the Special Archives at BYU, and they graciously they digitized it and put it on archive.org at my request. But I want you to read Henry, how do you say his name? Henry Kendall, his account. When I was about to leave Salt Lake City, Brigham Young asked me to preach to his people the next Sabbath. adding that he desired to have all his young people know what other denominations believed. Pause. There was a weird phenomenon back then when Christian missionaries came to Utah. It wasn't at first like, whoa, get away. It was like, ooh, this is interesting. It was like, just, a Christian missionary early on could basically just go, talk to the whole ward, but it was kind of like out of the sense of like, fascination, almost like a religious zoo animal, it wasn't like, they didn't feel threatened by it. You were just a foreigner coming in and desired to have all his young people know what other denominations believe, which I took to be only an artful way of claiming to be but another denomination of Christians. And as it would have seemed ungracious to insinuate that the other denominations would be very slow to reciprocate his civilities in kind, I cheerfully accepted the invitation, making no other reply. Sabbath morning, I was seated on a large platform behind a long desk, and nearly or quite 20 of the elders and chief priests of the church were seated around me. The whole service was given into my hands at the close of the sermon, to the close of the sermon. There was no difficulty in finding their hymn book, a number of approved and familiar hymns for my purpose. So, they stole all our Protestant hymns. So he's like, well, he basically conducted a service with Protestant hymns. The singing was by a choir, accompanied with instruments, the leader making quite a display of his professional abilities. The audience was large, perhaps the largest I ever addressed, entirely respectful and attentive. At the conclusion of the discourse, one of the elders arose and delivered a short address. It is customary for them to have 2 or 3 discourses at one session. I attended the service in the afternoon also, but as a listener and observer. I found there a custom which I do not remember ever to have seen noticed. They administer the communion every Sabbath afternoon. The blessing was asked on the bread just before the sermon, during which the distribution was made, though the sermon had no reference to this part of the service. When all was ready for the distribution of the cup, the preacher paused and asked for a blessing on it, and then proceeded with the discourse. But as their membership is very large, the communion seasons weekly, either from economy or necessity, they use water instead of wine. So Presbyterian minister is like, he goes on, my readers will be ready to inquire, what is the religion of the Mormons? They say that they believe all that we do and more. I've heard that before. Does that sound familiar? They say that they believe all that we do and more. They believe the Bible and the Book of Mormon besides. But the discourses I heard and the private interviews I had with the people led me to fear that though they use some of the same proof texts we do, they had a very different doctrine. Not much has changed, has it? Sorry for the long quote. I won't read the quote I have here, just in the interest of time, but this was interesting to me because they had to rent a hayloft at a livery stable at the expense of $50 a month. And then tradition says they then organized, and they were at a skating rink for some time. Some parts of the history are like, yeah, we got a big building. And I'm like, that's really neat. I'm really happy for you. But it was actually pretty neat to read about how you persevered through hard seasons where you were meeting in very, humbling circumstances. This is a picture of the Salt Lake Collegiate Institute, which later became Westminster College. This is B.H. Roberts. He's a Mormon general authority. He writes, the efforts of sectarian ministers who have come to Utah as missionaries to convert the Mormons to the creeds have always ended in dismal failure. Even those saints who, through neglect of religious duty or for other causes, have become indifferent as to their connection with the church, could not be persuaded to feed upon the dry husks of the dead theology preached by sectarian ministers, while those who were feeding to the full in the rich pastures of the gospel of Christ would not so much as look in the direction of the barren moors to which these missionaries invited them. This is basically B.H. Roberts is saying the Christian missionaries weren't that successful. It was very hard soil. Yeah, it was very hard. It's very hard soil. There was a lot of opposition. When McMillan arrived in Pleasant, is it Mount Pleasant? The school emptied out for a while. Had 54 pupils. He instructed them to drive him from the community. The 40 pupils were immediately withdrawn from the school, but McMillan stayed. Between 1887 and 1884, okay, I was wrong. 33 schools. That's still incredible. 33 schools were started. It's pretty cool. Presbyterians had a pretty neat thing going back then. In 1890, the territorial legislature passed the Public School Act, and this was the death knell for the Presbyterian schools in Utah. I just want you to feel for a second just how much of how cloud nine the Presbyterians felt they were at in 1887. And then as the public school developed, Presbyterians were in a position to contribute significant leadership and did so. I'm reading an article from Silliman. The first superintendent of public schools of Salt Lake City was J.F. Millspaugh, superintendent of the Salt Lake Collegiate Institute. That is to say, who was originally staffing the public schools? It was the trained teachers and leaders, administrators of Presbyterians. Okay. Some of these quotes stood out to me. This is Wishart describing sort of the revolving door of rural Christian ministers in Utah. The church at Salina has suffered greatly by reason of the brief terms of ministerial service. There is probably no place in our broad land where the little mission churches need such constant shepherding. He goes on to say, the Macedonian cry that is constantly going out from our small and needy mission churches meets with such infrequent responses that we are unable to prevent the constant depletion of our membership. He's basically saying they needed pulpit supply, they needed pastors, but it was these churches would empty out when there was no minister. So they're making pleas for young ministers to come help staff these churches. And one of my favorite quotes from the book that sums up, I think, the grief that resulted from the Presbyterians, just a sense of heartache over all that they invest, the money, the sacrifice, the time, the loneliness, the collective effort they pour. I just feel this with me. Our brothers poured themselves into the people of Utah. They loved the Mormon people. They loved Utah. I have been asked to write a brief history of our home mission work in Utah. It cannot be done, however. The shades of light and gloom cannot be written. The solicitudes, the prayers, the heart throbs that have been wrought into these years of toil by mission teachers and ministers cannot be traced. It's not just grief. The joy that has come to the laborers as precious souls have been gathered and lives changed is known only to those whose prayers have been answered. The gray dawn of the coming day in Utah brings with it abundant regard for all the days of anxious burden bearing. We prayerfully and patiently await for the full noon. We await that. We're still waiting, aren't we? We're still aching for that. I'll go through this a little more quickly. I think it's in 1897. What do you have now? You have public schools, you have more political integration, you have the official state of Utah, and the Christians in Utah are saying, hold up. You still need to understand that the LDS people are teaching a different gospel. So we're not considering the LDS Church another Christian denomination. So the Presbytery comes together and forms a document called 10 Reasons Why Christians Cannot Fellowship the Mormon Church. Shortly after, the Congregationalists and the Baptist Association sign off on the document. So 10 reasons. They list out essentially that the LDS Church has disfellowshipped all other Christian churches. It's unchurched all the other churches. In other words, it's said no other churches are valid, are authentic Christian authorized institutions. They put other revelations on par with the Bible. They hold belief in Joseph Smith as an essential article of faith. You have to affirm that he's a prophet in order to become a member of what they say is the only true church. Issues with the priesthood. Teaching that God is an exalted man. I want to point this out because this has been a concern, been a point of conflict from early on, not from the beginning of Mormonism, but from early on with pioneer Mormonism. When Christians have engaged Mormonism, they've made this a serious top 10 issue. That God is an exalted man who was once not yet God, who had to become a God. That idea. I mistitled number 6, but number 6 is that Adam is God. Now you have to understand, this is 1897. Has the LDS Church yet publicly denounced Adam God? No. Was it still in the collective consciousness? Was it still sort of at least hanging there in the memory of the people? Yes. It was really interesting reading these accounts. There were certain things about pioneer Mormon history that were still burned in the minds of the people. Mountain Meadows Massacre was huge. It was fixed in the memories of the people of Utah, the non-LDS people of Utah. Adam God was still there. It was a fixture. It's not that everyone believed it. It's that it was taught by a prophet. It was countenanced. It was not condemned. And you'll see in the literature in the first decade of the 1900s, even LDS people are writing letters into leadership asking, "Hey, do we still believe that? Is it like polygamy? Is it among the things that we publicly don't confess but privately still believe? Is it kind of in that weird space where we have certain things we just don't talk about as freely publicly?" And you had James Talmage go on to teach a different framework that essentially dismantled the Adam God framework, but that hadn't taken effect yet. So Christians were still, I call this giving the benefit of doubt. You say you have a prophet, he teaches something publicly. Well, we're giving you the benefit of doubt that you believe your prophets, right? And so evangelicals, by giving the benefit of doubt, they were entrusting that the LDS people took their own prophets seriously. It's kind of awkward today because the insistence today is, well, if you love us, if you care about us, if you're not being malicious toward us, then you'll stop assuming that we trust what our prophets say about God, right? It's like, it really offends me when you assume that I trust what my prophets teach is credible about the nature of God. Historically, if you really respected me, you would know that I pick and choose what my prophets teach. I'm saying that very bluntly, right? But even back then, Christians are saying, hey, your church had a prophet who taught this publicly, and you've never yet denounced it. And so we're sticking you to it. We're saying, hey, you're accountable for this. This is something that we can associate with the larger religious movement. And that gets really complicated because it's like, what do they teach? What did they teach? What do they believe? What do they, so it's kind of a mess. But the LDS Church is polytheistic was another complaint. It teaches a system of depending on good works for salvation. Christians were noting that point of conflict even in the 1890s. The Mormon Church believes in polygamy, and they're very aware of the 1890 Manifesto. They say this was not a repudiation of the doctrine of plural marriage. It did not claim to be such. So they're noting that the 1890 Manifesto suspended polygamy, but it did not denounce the doctrine of polygamy. So they still believe in polygamy. Number 10, they teach that God is a polygamist. This is one of those things, again, that Pratt and Young taught that had not been denounced. It was still sort of part of the memory of LDS teachings. Okay, pause there, take a breath. Where is the spirit of Utah Presbyterianism today? I'm gonna make Jason squirm so bad right now. Well, not really. Here's some good stuff. There is a conservative. By conservative, I'm talking baseline, not LGBTQ affirming, holding biblical ethics of male-female marriage, monogamy, male-female marriage, upholding the inerrancy of the Bible, standard evangelical, faithful, believing Presbyterian churches. There's at least 8 Presbyterian Church of America. It's PCA. If you've never been in this, if you've never swam in these waters, I'll teach you something. PCA is good. PCUSA is bad. PCUSA has given up on the inerrancy of the Bible. They are running as fast as they can in a bad direction, affirming LGBTQ stuff. So those churches, we don't consider them a part of the same family of Bible-believing Spirit indwelled Christians. PCA is great. All right, those are trustworthy believers. If someone goes to a PCA church, you should say, "Praise the Lord." So we have at least 8 of those in Utah. We also have OPC. OPC. How many OPC churches are in Utah?
2 churches, 1 mission work.
Excellent. So at least one in Magna. Where's the other one?
Clearfield.
Clearfield. And the mission
Provo.
in Provo. Okay. Are you preaching at all this? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, our sister church is without a pastor.
Okay.
Clearfield.
Well, praise the Lord for the OPC, Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And we have Christ Presbyterian Church pastored by Jason Wallace, who's here amongst us in primarily Magna. Now, on another note, that church we talked about that was originally organized and had humble circumstances in the hayloft and the ice rink, and they were going strong, and they had pastors that would put in multiple decades of faithful service and faithful preaching, faithful ministry work, faithful mission school, missionary activity, faithful, great believers in Utah. What does that look like today in the same buildings? At the First Presbyterian Church of Salt Lake City, we have a not just a female pastor, but a female pastor. So you can it's sort of pictorial representation here of a celebration of genderqueer stuff, and this snapshot is of a sermon where she is defending homosexuality. So this is downtown, and this is a devastating. I'm not trying to make light of this. This is a devastating situation where all those established church buildings, and if there's some sort of institutional continuity, is just rank apostasy at this point. First Baptist Church of Salt Lake City, same issue. First Presbyterian Church of Salt Lake City. So those older established churches, they've got all the best buildings. But that's not what defines us, right? Better that we be faithful in a hayloft. I like to say, better that we meet in a swimming pool with water and be faithful. But there's a really sad dissent here that happened. Westminster College today. Is that called Westminster University today? Westminster in Salt Lake City is probably one of the most liberal educational institutions in the state of Utah. I can't even say out loud for video recording some of the classes they've had in the last couple of years. It's bad. It's very bad. They have utterly rejected the Christian tradition. It's hard to even have a Christian club at this point at Westminster College. I've heard of students having a ton of difficulty and hostility there to even just having a faithful Christian volunteer student club there. I'll tell you a little story. I went down to Farron, Utah with a friend, Andrew, to go visit some believers. Was this a couple months ago, I think? Lo and behold, this little church that we went to on Sunday morning met at an old Presbyterian building, Farron Academy, a little plaque there. Around 1911, they erected this building as the Farron Wasatch Academy, one of 40 such institutions in Utah. Now, what's interesting about this is erected in 1911, so it's one of the few Presbyterian buildings, churches erected after the, right? So there's not a lot of new churches coming up. This is one of them. It remained a church and school until 1942. Praise God. Praise God for 3 decades. It was sold to the Farron American Legion post number 42. So I went down to the basement, and they have the old church organ down there. But, lots of veteran stuff, USA flags, really great stuff. I even went back into one of the storage rooms and found the old wooden chairs. Oh, it's old wooden folding chairs. It's like, man, I wish I could take one home to the Utah Christian Research Center, And there's a guy there named Brad Benson. He's not the pastor of the church, but he's sort of the discipler, as I understand it. He's the discipler brother, influential big brother, at the church, and they need a pastor at this church. It's not a Presbyterian church, but I want to ask you about Brad and the people that meet there. And we went to their church service, and a lot of what's happening in the back is people are setting up lawn chairs, and they sit on a folding chair or a lawn chair. They don't have a pastor. There was no pulpit supply that day. So what they do, they piped into Gospel Hope at Riverton. They did a live stream. And I heard about this. We have a church down in Farron that just sort of live streams and listens to our church services. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. So we went down there. Yeah. They sing with us. They listen to the sermon. They're still hoping someday for, pastor. But they're pretty happy. They love the Lord. I went to a Bible study before the church service. Beautiful window at the building. Oh, ironically, there were these giant chalkboards in the back. You see the chalkboards? It used to be an academy, a schoolhouse. And ironically, at the corner of one of the chalkboards was Matthew 18:20. I love the spirit of this. For where two or more are gathered in my name, I am there among them. So I want to ask you about this. I want to ask you about that. What better continues the spirit of our Presbyterian brothers? Who are the great spiritual grandchildren of the Presbyterians? It's mostly not Presbyterians. It's just the evangelicals in Utah, I think, are the spiritual offspring of the Utah Presbyterians. There was a Baptist conference down in Provo months ago, I forget, earlier this year. And it was a bunch of Reformed particular Baptist, meeting to talk, to hear about, what was the topic, the preaching topic? It was,
Get old.
but it was Richard Barcellos, hermeneutics, preached a masterful, lecture series on hermeneutics. And you had a bunch of Baptists, and on the left, I remember looking to my left and seeing a Presbyterian pastor there with us, singing with us. And we were singing together, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. That was really special. In light of me thinking also about Utah history, here we are. It's pretty special. It was April 2025. I got a message from Tom Hobson. I said, Aaron, you got to look at this. In 1880, Presbyterians bought this precise half acre of land for $10 with the plan to plant a church in Moroni, Utah. What was it? I thought I heard something. Moroni, Utah. They followed the model used in nearby Mount Pleasant, beginning with a school. In 1883, Moroni was canvassed by the American Tract Society. Ooh, maybe we'll learn about that in subsequent years. I think they're called coal porters. I don't know how you say the name. Coal porters, selling Bibles, giving out tracts, traveling in wagons. Crazy street preachers and evangelists in Utah. And a service was held here by Swedish-born pastor who was fluent in Scandinavian languages of the local immigrants. By 1885, the effort was abandoned, and the land was sold 30 years later for $150. And he asks, will there ever be a church that believes in the triune God planted in Moroni? God only knows. There is not such a single church here at the moment. Pray to the Lord of the harvest to fulfill that vision toward which Presbyterians took their first step here back in 1880. Yes. Tiny little seed, tiny little effort, abandoned for now in Moroni, Utah. Last slide. How can you help? I'm not even talking about missions here. I'm talking about history and research. If you're a nerd and you want to contribute to the collective effort, I think it would be great to build out a timeline of Presbyterian church history in a bullet point format. To build out a bibliography, if you want to help. If you're a blogger or a social media, a socialite, if you're a social media poster, you know what we need to do with our brothers and sisters in Utah? We need to start spreading the word about the heroes of Utah And sometimes the hero is a Sheldon Jackson who traveled 1,000,000 miles and planted, 80 missions and, tons of churches. And sometimes it's a little 5-year stint of a faithful sister in Christ who poured herself out for young children in Utah. Those are heroes of the faith that we don't know about. We're historical orphaning. We're orphaning ourselves by not seeing ourselves as within the stream of Utah Christianity. I am here. I'm a part of a tradition. I have a heritage in Utah of believers reaching the people here and planting gospel outposts. I love the idea of a church is like an embassy. It's a kingdom outpost. And we're part of a tradition. We have a lot of, if you go to the University of Utah Digital Library online, or the Westminster University, very liberal today, but it has a digital library of a bunch of what? Presbyterian material. And it's just sitting there. Either digitally, it's just there, not being used, or materially, they have a bunch of material that's never been digitized sitting on shelves right now. And I'm like, please, are there any nerds? Are there any researchers who can help digitize? And sometimes these pictures are very low quality and it's helpful just to AI enhance it, just to like do the before and after and just show people the color on the building, To find pictures of graves, I'll publish this page probably today, mrm.org/Presbyterians.